Hello everybody, welcome to our range management lecture for natural resources. And remember, you can follow along using the PDF version of this lecture to be able to look at the slides as well as click on any of the links to watch any of the videos or supplemental information. And here we go. So, what is range? Any land covered with vegetation that's suitable for grazing. So, any land, most people think grassland, shrubland. In California, we've got a lot of this area just right here locally where it's suitable for grazing. A lot of these areas have been set up now for domestic grazing, but when we're saying grazing, it could be wild animals or domestic. When we're talking about rangeland, we're talking about uncultivated land, so land not used for agriculture that provides forage and browse specifically for large animals. Another way to look at it is land where the potential plant cover is composed principally of native grasses, grass-like plants, and forbs or shrubs that are suitable for grazing or browsing. These areas are usually dominated by native plants, mostly grasses, some broadleaf plants, wildflowers, shrubs. However, lately, there's been a lot of problems with exotics, depending on fire management strategies and different overgrazing, undergrazing, and we'll kind of get into some of those issues towards the end of this lecture. One of the big things to really understand with rangeland is the idea of evapotranspiration often exceeding precipitation. And so the idea that you're losing more water than is coming into the system. So remember, evapotranspiration is that combination of evaporation, the water changing back into gas form, back into the atmosphere, and then transpiration, the plants using the water and then it going back into the atmosphere. So that combination usually is exceeding the amount of water coming into the system. So right here, for this area in Texas on the Rio Grande Plains, we have an example of that. So you can see at the top, so on the left it says that they get 12 inches a year in one area, and in the other area they get 35 inches per year. And the ET on each of these graphs is evapotranspiration. And you can see on the left there's that 12-inch mark, and for grass and shrub areas it's right there or right above it. And for the grass and shrub areas in the 35 inches per year, it's right at and just below. So you're losing the majority of your water, almost all of it or more than it, to evapotranspiration, which is going to make it hard for these areas to grow trees or grow really large shrubs. So that's why these areas are going to end up being dominated by grass and by smaller shrubs, because that's what they can that's basically what they can afford to have there because of the limiting factor of water in these areas. So here's another kind of graphical way to look at it. So let's say we get 20 inches of rainfall to start out with. We'll lose a couple inches to runoff. Then that means we got 18 inches getting into our soil and being able to be used. Well, we might lose like 5 inches of that to undesirable plants. We'll lose like 8 inches of it to evaporation, maybe an inch to deep percolation, gets into the groundwater and then leaches through. So now we're down to like 5 inches that actually get into our desirable plants for our animals, and then maybe the animals only get about an inch of that water. So it's really interesting to really think about how limiting of a factor water could be on these rangelands. So just a very quick history of rangelands in the United States. So Europeans brought over exotic species. They brought with them sheep, cattle, horses, goats. Horses are actually native to North America, but we'll talk about that in the second half of the lecture. They displaced, and displaced is a nice way of saying killed or exterminated, many of the native grazers. We've talked about how bison used to have such a large range for their population, and now they have a very small area in which they live. They've been extirpated from a lot of their native range. Same with elk and deer, and so that's really changed the way that rangelands are used, because now rangelands are used much more for domesticated animals than they are for these native grazers. And it's different because the domesticated animals are fenced in. They're in some places overstocked. They're being given supplemental feeding and watering. They're not really using the land the way that the native grazers were. The native grazers would chew up an area, eat it, move on. They'd also, be in those areas. They'd be pooping in those areas or dying in those areas. So they'd be giving back to the whole process of the soil in that way as well. And so you don't have that nomadic part of the grazing anymore. You lost the movement. You don't have the size of these herds of animals anymore. And so it's really just changed the way range is used. So why talk about rangelands? Why have rangelands and rangeland management be one of the bigger issues in natural resources? And the real answer is because 50% of the Earth's surface falls into this category of rangelands, and about a third of the U.S., which is 1 billion acres or so, falls into the category of rangeland. And the majority of land west of the Mississippi in the United States is rangeland. And it's about half owned by the government, or half managed by the government, and half owned by private citizens. And I've got a video down here at the bottom for you to click on. So in terms of where do we have rangelands in the world, where you can see Northern Africa, the Middle East, the majority of the Australian continent, the majority of the southern part of South America, and then the majority of the western United States. Those are our big rangeland areas. Our big areas where you have this evaporation exceeding precipitation, and so we don't really get forested areas. We'll end up more with grass or desert or shrubs or woodlands. And we'll talk about the differences between those. So, in terms of the United States, the majority of the federal land that falls under the category of rangeland, which is about a tenth, an eighth, somewhere in there, it's like 247 million acres, that's managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The Bureau of Land Management first started off as the General Land Office, and it was set up with people moving west in the United States. They did a lot of land surveying, and then eventually moved on to this idea of becoming the Bureau of Land Management. And now their big things are managing the rangelands and managing minerals and managing for multiple use, similar to the Forest Service. Specifically here in California, this map on the left is the Bureau of Land Management offices in the areas where they have management plans. And so you can see down here in Southern California, the Bakersfield office, which is located up by the airport next to the Bakersfield California newspaper. That field office there manages basically the southern part of the Central Valley all the way to the coast, and then there's a South Coast section that manages the coastal area, because a lot of the area on the southern half of California falls into this rangeland management. And you can see on the right here, when we look at an even more detailed map, you can see that all that's in the green falls into the idea of rangelands. And now you might say, well, look at the Central Valley doesn't have a lot of those areas. Yeah, because it's become developed now. If we didn't have a lot of the urban, and we didn't have a lot of the areas where they've kind of changed the ecosystem, you'd see that whole area being rangelands as well. But a lot of California can fall into this rangelands category because we're in the western United States, where water is a limiting factor. So looking at the whole western United States, how to read this map. So each of these little gold dots represents 25,000 acres. And each of those little gold dots, it's rangeland, but it's privately owned rangeland. Whereas the crosshatched areas, that's the federal land. So there's a lot of rangeland out there. in the western United States. So one thing to notice or think about is, what is this used for? And so we talked about the idea of rangelands being land that's got vegetation suitable for grazing. And so more than a third of the U.S. is used for, as Bloomberg News calls it, pasture, but the idea of grazing. And that's by far the largest land use type in the 48 contiguous states. And so it's really an important idea if we value the idea of having a cattle industry, a sheep industry, goat industry, all those sorts of things, that we really look at these rangelands and really make sure we're managing them correctly and really having ecologically sound management ideas. So what is a rangeland? How do we really characterize it? How do we really decide and say this fits into that category? So there's 4 kind of bigger rangeland characteristics. So one is the idea of low precipitation, somewhere between 2 to 24 inches per year. Bakersfield here gets about 6.5 inches. So really falls right into that category. Usually the soils will be low in organic matter, nutrients, or both. Organic matter, remember, is that top layer of the soils where you're getting a lot of material falling down and then working its way into becoming soil. And so you have, usually these areas, you have less organic matter because you don't have as much up above to become organic matter. And then if you have less organic matter, you're more than likely going to have less nutrients. Usually these areas have rugged topography, and I think that plays a lot into the idea of why these areas struggle with water retention. And then you also get temperature extremes. Depending on where you are in some of these rangelands, you can go from negative 40 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, because you can have some really warm deserty areas, and you can have some areas up high that end up being really cold, or farther north, tundra-ish areas that end up being pretty cold. So in terms of our types of rangelands, we're gonna focus on four basic types. So the one that people are probably most familiar with is just the idea of a grassland. So that's just an ecosystem, a rangeland ecosystem dominated by grasses. Some of the different names you might hear: tall grass, short grass, or mixed grass prairie, desert grasslands, southern mixed prairie, alpine meadows, tundra grasslands, prairie, steppe, pampas, swards, meadows, velds. They're all just different words that mean a grassland. And so what's a grassland? An area where the vegetation is dominated by grasses or other herbaceous just meaning non-woody plants such as forbs. What's interesting about grasslands, though, is these are the areas where you get the greatest diversity of grazing animals and predators on the planet. In terms of shrublands, this is what we see a lot of down here in Southern California. This is your chaparral areas, your coastal sage scrub areas. They're going to fall into this category. So when you get to the coast down here, the southern coast, and you get to the mountains and the hills, you'll see a lot of these areas. If you drive on I-5 going to LA and go through the grapevine, the majority of the grapevine falls into this shrubland category. So shrublands are ecosystems with abundant stands of shrubs and usually an understory of grasses or herbaceous plants. You'll hear words: chaparral, sagebrush steppe, tundra shrublands, mountain browse, mesquite. In the world, you'll hear terms like cerrados, shrub steppe, maquis, and scrublands. They're all meaning these areas dominated by shrubs. Woodlands and savannas, or woodlands or savannas, it's really just meaning an area that's usually dominated by grass, but then with widely spaced trees mixed in. So it's widely spaced trees, and then you have the understory of grasses and forbs. So you'll hear the term here in California a lot, oak woodlands. And so I've got a picture of that kind of down below there, where it's the idea that we have a lot of these grassy areas, but then we still have this overstory of oak trees. In the western United States, pinyon juniper, so pinyons are small pine trees where we get pine nuts from, and junipers are another small conifer, and that's the largest woodland in the U.S. It makes up a large part of the western United States. Other ones, if you're in Texas, you'll run into mesquite woodlands. If you're in Colorado, Wyoming, you might run into some aspen savannas. But basically, it's these areas that have the understory of grasses and forbs with the overstory of trees, but not enough trees to make up a forest, a really discontiguous group of trees. More than likely, if you see a group or a contiguous group of trees in these woodland areas, more than likely there's some sort of source of water to be able to sustain that population. Here's a picture of an aspen, some aspen in the foreground, but then in the foreground you've got some pinyon pines. Our other type of rangeland, our fourth type of rangeland, is deserts. So these are going to be the driest rangelands. They're going to experience extreme water deficits and definitely unpredictable precipitation. That's the big deal with deserts as to why you don't see a lot of vegetation and very little to no organic matter on the surface. More than likely, no organic matter. These areas are usually dominated by shrubs and cactus. Cactus being a plant that holds a lot of moisture, so it can handle these conditions. It's moved its way out to the desert because it can handle that. It likes that niche. It can handle a little bit more. It's got a little more tolerance to stay a little farther away. The deserts in the U.S., we have the Mojave out here in California. We also have the Sonoran and the Chihuahuan deserts. And I've got a video clip here about the idea of what happens when it actually rains in the desert. Because when you do get precipitation, there is vegetation there waiting to come out. It just, the precipitation is so unpredictable, it usually, that's why these areas just don't stay covered in vegetation. So in terms of, if we try and look at all of the western United States together and where do we see some of these different areas, this graphic here just kind of puts it together. Where would I find pinyon juniper? Where would I find desert shrublands? Where would I find oak woodlands? Where would I find the tall grass, mixed grass, and short grass prairies? So how is rangeland used, or why is it important to us? So rangeland itself would fall into that renewable resource category under ecosystems. Just the whole idea of the rangeland working together as an ecosystem. You got these areas are important because they take solar energy, they capture it with the plants that they have. Most of the time that's grass, but then that energy is then transferred up the trophic structure to grazing animals, and then eventually to us. So it's extremely important in terms of us and in terms of human beings and what we want in terms of food we want to eat. Rangelands are being managed for multiple use, similar to forests. And so when we say multiple use, we're talking about that they offer up multiple benefits, and therefore they need to be managed to maximize all the benefits that we can get. And in terms of that being actual federal policy, that happened in 1976 in the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, that allowed for rangelands to be managed under this multiple use strategy. So this idea that that the grazing animals are important, getting fiber or wood off this land is important, clean water, recreation, managing for wildlife, managing for minerals, managing for timber, managing for just the idea of open space and aesthetics. All of those things are important to people. And so we're going to manage this land for all of it, not just for the idea of grazing. So what does that look like? Well, we can manage this land for livestock production. We can create forage for either wild animals or other types of livestock. We can manage it for recreation, water, grow some native plants, and try and get rid of exotic species. We can manage for minerals. We can manage for natural energy, solar energy, wind energy. We can manage for open space, and then just trying to put this in a beautiful mosaic that people would appreciate and find aesthetically pleasing. So in terms of livestock production, that's the big one. And we talked about that earlier. So range and pasture land in the 19 western states are home to almost 60% of all the beef cattle in the U.S. And in terms of these rangelands, they're also about 80% of the sheep and 90% of the goats in the U.S. So pretty much if you are a meat eater, your meat is coming from the western United States somewhere. Livestock production on these rangelands is very important to our meat supply and actually world populations as well. And then also in terms of if you wear anything leather or wool or mohair or any of these other things that come off of livestock, that all ties in together under this idea of having these good rangelands available for livestock production. Wildlife habitat. So rangelands provide habitat for countless numbers of mammals, birds, amphibians, fish, and insects. Just to kind of give you some idea of it, so in rangelands, you got about 84% of the mammals in the U.S., 74% of the birds, about 60% of the amphibians found in the U.S., and about 40% of the fish found in the U.S. all reside within rangelands. So recreation is becoming extremely important these days, more than ever before. You've got national parks that are located on rangelands, and you've got just rangelands that are used either privately or publicly. And I've got a link here to a video from Idaho that talks about different recreation. So what falls under the idea of recreation? Bird and wildlife watching, camping and hiking, skiing, snowboarding, driving and sightseeing, fishing and hunting, ATVs, snowmobiling, horseback riding, mountain bike riding, rafting, canoeing, kayaking, rock climbing, or just hanging out in nature. And there's probably a whole bunch of other things that you could qualify as recreational activities, but just the idea of people getting out into nature and finding a way to enjoy it. In terms of open space, what's the idea of open space? I think you see it a lot in these images here, just the idea of being able to see land and look at land. It's one of the things that I enjoy being at Bakersfield College and being able to go out to Panorama Park and just look out on the vista and kind of see for a way. There's definitely a lot of people that value the idea of open space. And there's a lot of people who are environmentally concerned with the idea of just keeping open space and wanting to have a lot of open space and not wanting to see urban development. And then there's also the idea of the Western heritage and just the idea of people thinking of the United States and our history and kind of keeping that Western image that we've had. So right here I've got a video that I'd like for you to definitely take a look at, where it just talks about kind of that Western life and that that idealized life of the cowboy that people kind of associate with the Western United States, and it's really important to some people that we really keep this this heritage that we have. In terms of multiple use, another term that is going to be brought to the forefront lately is the idea of ecosystem services. And so when we're talking about ecosystem services, we're trying to say, what do these areas offer you, and how can we kind of quantify it? So when you're talking about a rangeland, they provide biological diversity. They provide carbon sequestration. So the idea that they're storing carbon and they're holding carbon for the future. They provide ecological function, meaning that they're keeping the ecosystem healthy and moving and keeping all the parts working together. They're protecting the environment. They're providing forage or crop production. They're providing recreation. They're providing wood production. They're providing poverty alleviation by providing jobs and by providing areas for people to work in. There's all sorts of good things that you can take from rangelands, and there's even more than this. This one's just a comparison between forest lands and rangelands. But the real big idea for me in terms of ecosystem services is the idea that you're really, when you think about rangelands, there's so much more to it than just here's an area with grass and we can put large animals on it. I think it really just is one of those ecosystems where you really have to see all the parts and how all the parts work together, and think about all these multiple uses and all these ecosystem services to really think about how important these areas are and what they really provide to us. And then we're going to continue on with the rest in the second part of the lecture.